Hello, welcome to our webinar, Digitizing Critical Pedagogies Amidst COVID-19. My name is Amber Murray and I teach in the School of Geography and the Environment at Mansfield College and the University of Oxford. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. The event has been organized by the Political Worlds Cluster at the School of Geography. I am a co-coordinator of the cluster along with my colleague Sneha Krishnan, who I hope upon her arrival will be the discussant for today's conversation. And the event has been organized in collaboration with the Department of Education at Oxford, and more precisely with my friend, Steve Puttick, who will say a few words and introduce the speakers in a bit. We hope that this webinar is a working conversation amongst an interdisciplinary group of scholars who are united by a shared commitment to anti-racist and anti-imperial teaching. We have gathered scholars working in imperial institutions and post-colonial universities in education, geography, and international relations. We've asked our panelists to share some of their working tactics and strategies for seeking to transition some of the fullness and the richness of the embodied classroom to a digital learning environment. I will open the dialogue with a few brief thoughts about why Steve and I put this webinar together. The first is to critique this notion that this transition is a pivot or that it is self-evident. It is certainly not a pivot for learners or educators who seek to challenge the banking model of education. We know that knowledge is not a static object to be uploaded and to be downloaded. For this reason, lecture capture, the technology that permits filming and uploading of lectures in universities in the UK, for example, have not replaced embodied forms of teaching. Even as lecture capture remains a fixture of the neoliberal university in the United Kingdom, a fixture that is troubling, for it seeks to organize critical thinking as if it were another item or good to be exchanged in the capitalist marketplace. So how do we move to create and foster transformative teaching experiences digitally? And especially when the content of our teaching is dangerous to the very capitalist and imperial institutions which employ us. Indeed, our pandemic context reveals the urgencies of being able to communicate with learners and our students about the normalized threats of heightened racisms and nationalisms, which are at the core of modern imperialism and racial statecraft. We know our students and learners face complex material, financial, emotional, and infrastructural challenges. For anti-racist and anti-imperial or decolonial teaching and learning, educators face the dilemmas of being frequently targeted, marginalized, doxxed, and harassed. And much of this is done online. We know from the scholarship of Sophia Noble and others that the digital world is not a flat world. As the recent episodes of Zoom bombing, racist insults at faculty of color in the United States have shown, digital tools can be used to reinforce already existing racisms and classisms. What then does a creative, learner-driven curriculum look like in the midst of a pandemic? How are our colleagues getting along in other parts of the world? We have encouraged our panelists to ground their comments today in their own experiences. I hope they are provocative, and I know that they will be invaluable. Each panelist will speak for about 12 minutes, and I will collect your questions throughout for one final round of collective Q&A. I will now defer to my colleague Steve, who will introduce our speakers. Again, thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Amber, and thanks so much everyone for joining us, and particularly to our panelists. And I'm so thrilled that we've got such a great mix of people who have done so much amazing work. And I'm so excited to see kind of where our discussion is going to go, and the kinds of things that hopefully we'll be able to, over this period of time, discuss. So I'm going to introduce people really briefly. I'd encourage you to, if you're not already familiar, to have a look, because they've got so much great stuff that everyone's done. But just really brief introduction in the order that people are going to be speaking, and then people are going to speak for 10 to 13 minutes, and we won't have a kind of a break or a kind of further introduction between those. So we're going to start with Derek Ford, who's in education at DePauw University, and his most recent book is on politics and pedagogy in the post-truth era, insurgent philosophy and praxis. Following Derek, we'll have Holly Oberle, who's in political science at Wenzhou-Kean University, and he's currently working on projects that look closely at discourse and gendered language in politics. Following Holly, we have Farhana Sultana, who's in geography at Syracuse. He's done a huge amount of fascinating interdisciplinary work, and his recent books, Water Politics, Governance, Justice, and the Right to Water. Then Sayan, who's in English at Royal University of Bhutan, who's done some fascinating, really recent work around COVID-19, and who has a forthcoming edited collection on myth, history, and post-colonial consciousness, theory, praxis, and politics, which is an edited collection coming out with Routledge. And then finally, Lesley Nelson-Addy, who's in education at Oxford, who's currently reading for a DPhil, who was a school teacher and also teaches English teachers on Oxford's PGCE programme. And Amber's also mentioned briefly that Sneha Krishnan is in geography at Oxford and will be acting as a discussant. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Derek.
Great, thanks so much. Let me set my timer. Okay, so I wanted to focus my comments on the question of pedagogy, by which I don't mean strategies or tactics, but something that's more general, in that the form of relations that take place in education. So the sort of logics through which we relate to educational content and educational subjects, ourselves included, and talk about the sort of dominant educational logic at work and an alternative potential educational logic. So the dominant pedagogy operating not just in schools, but throughout society is learning. And learning is defined as the acquisition or actualization or achievement of certain goals, outcomes, whether those are about information and knowledge, or they're about beliefs or ways of being in the world. So learning is organized around actualizing potentials. And so when we learn, we're continually developing our capacities. So we begin in a state in which we have a potential to do something, to act in a certain way, and then we progress to a state in which we do that thing. And in order for this to work, the goals or outcomes have to be predetermined. It's only because we know what a particular thing looks like that we can then develop it and then measure it or evaluate it and judge whether a student has actualized that potential. And so learning is about a passage from potential to the actual. It's organized by predetermined ends, and it operates according to a model of development. An irony of learning, though, is that it's driven by ends, but it itself is a never-ending process. The development never stops, right? So the school and the university are no longer just about learning particular things, but rather learning how to learn. And this flexibility is key to explaining why learning is the educational logic of neoliberalism, because we have to constantly retool and reskill ourselves in response to the ever-shifting demands of the global market. But learning is also, I think, the educational motor of colonialism and imperialism, which are about land and resources, ideologies, but also a will to learn, to acquire knowledge about the world that's both materially and ideally, exhibited, mapped, cataloged, categorized, and that demands a transparency and the elimination of opacity. And for a potential to be actualized, right, the subjects of education must make themselves visible and identifiable throughout the process. And I think this explains some of the shift to digital technology in the pandemic. I mean, first, I think it explains the entire framing of shifting online, because learning is a generalized, abstract, and universalizing process. It can merely be shifted or transitioned. All we need are new strategies or forms of assessment. And it also explains the need to shift online in the first place, because when education is organized around actualizing potentials, then any interruption in that developmental process is seen as a deficit to be overcome, right? An impediment to development. And then, okay, so what's an alternative pedagogy? And here I want to talk about studying as something that's sort of antagonistic to learning, because learning is determined by ends, but studying is about means. So when we set out to study something, we have an end in mind, a dissertation or an article or whatever. But once we begin to study, the end is sort of suspended. And as you study, you're drawn to some kind of indeterminate goal while also withdrawing from it, right? So it's more a process of sort of getting lost and getting distracted. And while the learner actualizes potential, the studier dwells within potentiality, such that it's sort of divorced from the command to actualize. So I don't know if you've had this experience, but whenever I'm working on something and somebody asks me about it, like, what's your stance on it? Or what did you find? I always hesitate, right? Like I could tell them something, but I also can't tell them because I'm not at an end, right? And I'm not really sort of driven by that end. And I think of it like the educational logic of flirting, because when two people are flirting, they're in a state of potentiality that's divorced from actualization, right? They're interested in each other. They could start a relationship, but they could also not start a relationship, right? They might do either, or they might do something else altogether. So it's a more open experience, right? And part of the joy of flirting is this kind of suspension between doing and not doing. But learning looks at flirting as like a sort of developmental state that must be overcome as quickly as possible, right? So that a relationship can begin or end. But as a studier, the flirter remains within the tension and ambiguity that's associated with potentiality as such. And so because of this, while the learner knows things, the studier remains stupid. And this is why I think it's important that student, study, and stupidity all share the same root word, because when you're studying, you're sort of shocked and stupefied by things, right? That you can't really explain, but you also can't leave them, right? You're sort of also held by them in some way. So the studier doesn't develop, but is rather constantly interrupted and distracted. And even when we finally produce something as a result of studying, we can't trace a path backwards that would fully capture the experience of studying or show how it manifests in the finished product. And so studying is something that can't be evaluated, and it also allows opacity to remain opacity. So, I think the question is this: can we use digital technologies to study or to interrupt the logic of learning? And I mean, I'll qualify what I say here by, just stating that I think that concrete collective spaces are absolutely crucial to education and to studying. I think that we should collectively struggle to defend these, but that's another topic. So one way to understand the institutional response to the pandemic is as a rush to preserve the logic of learning in the face of this interruption, an overwhelming interruption. But this is why I think so many of us are so troubled by the shift, is because the pedagogy of learning is being interrupted. And so the first thing I did in my class was to let the interruption persist. So for example, I didn't revise my course objectives, but I suspended them. So they're still there, but they're just not really in force, right? The student could meet them and also could not meet them. Second, I only had one class meeting with my students. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but I wanted to do at least one meeting. And everybody used either filters to obscure their faces or their cameras were off. Everyone also talked with voice filters, and everyone changed their display names on Zoom. So the students and I both were and were not present, and were not recognizable. So we were neither sort of like opaque or transparent, but somewhere sort of in between the two. We could only wonder about who was who, which disrupted our experience of each other as owners and representatives of knowledge. We found that the discussion wasn't based on an exchange of words, but a play with ideas, because not only did we not know who was who, but we also couldn't keep track of who said what. So whereas typically in class, you know, we say a comment and then we respond to people, and then we sort of keep words tied to certain people by referencing them later. In this class, the relationship between identity and words was interrupted. It's not that it was annihilated, but that it was suspended. It was held sort of in abeyance. And then there's one other assignment where students are required to Zoom bomb our classes in some way that forces an unexpected presence, interruption, or redirection of the classroom discussion. So for these, cameras are on and we're not using voice filters. A student might be in the class on the phone, but they would later log into the class on a computer and use some element of the platform to intervene in class. So this could take the form of like a haunting where someone signs in as like the author that we're discussing that day, right? And like uses their image and uses their name and types things in chat to sort of respond to us. Or maybe doesn't even type things in chat, but is just sort of there as a looming, you know, presence that we're wondering about. It could also take on a sort of more forceful role, like signing in as another person and pasting copies of certain texts from the class, or you know, responses, or sort of you know, spamming the chat as a way of distracting our attention away from the content and allowing ourselves to establish a different relationship to it that's not based on a consumptive relation of like rendering the text transparent, but sort of letting it be opaque. And so it's not like a takeover of the class or something that causes the class to end, but rather something that opens up the class in a new way. Thank you.
I'm Farhana Sultana. I'm in the geography department at Syracuse University, where I'm also faculty affiliated in 8 other programs. So today I kind of want to talk about some of the challenges and the approaches that I've tried and the strategies, and then the lessons learned, but then also the challenges and opportunities from those lessons learned. And I have 3 main themes that I'm going to talk about, and then, you know, kind of just some ideas and lessons that I've learned in each of them. So what happened at Syracuse University was that, as many of you know, the US was very slow and late to respond to what was going on globally with this pandemic, and then it happened really quickly. And Syracuse is based in upstate New York. Among the states, New York and California were fairly ahead of the rest of the country, but it went into lockdown fairly quickly, and it was a real disruption to our teaching. So we teach in person. I don't teach online courses. My students don't take online courses. It's a private institution, it's a private university. And the courses I teach, despite their ontological differences or epistemological takes, pedagogically, I prioritize feminist, anti-racist, and anti-imperial and decolonial pedagogies and strategies. And this I found from, you know, many, many years of teaching, is that it's easier for me, having been trained in in-person teaching and learning, and also for my students, because in-person classroom allowed that kind of interactive pedagogy in the courses that I have, which are both a combination of lectures, but then much of this semester's courses were reading-driven seminars and involving discussions and critical thinking. So the sudden transition was a real burden on faculty and students alike, because nobody was really familiar with it, and it happened very quickly. And what happened was the sudden transition, it was, we were all kind of learning by doing at both the faculty end and at the student end. And the sudden transition required a rapid way to learn about how to do this. And this definitely discounted the additional labor time in reconfiguring courses, like syllabi that were developed for in-person teaching to online teaching and online learning. But it also involved trying to deal with institutional response time and their control of technology, different modes of usage of platforms. While we were still facing these narratives of care from the institution, we didn't really have a lot of shared governance or consultation with faculty and students about how best to proceed. So one of my first things that I did, because we transitioned so rapidly, was immediately undertake a student survey to learn about their challenges, concerns, and situations. I just quickly developed overnight a Google form. I did a lot of research in a day or so in what kind of questions I should ask. And this is because largely my praxis involves a lot of issues around practicing or a praxis of empathy and compassion and solidarity building for intellectual flourishing, but also to ensure that students are learning in the best possible way that they can under the given circumstances. So through the survey, I was able to understand what the problems were, or what would work, what would not work. And I worked collaboratively with students to configure what would work in a revised syllabi. And then at the same time, it was an open dialogue about the various embodied struggles between both faculty and students. And what we learned through this is that both productive and reproductive labor in the home was being discounted for both students and faculty. And this kind of labor, this added labor of both students and faculty was being largely invisibilized, but then the added labor of faculty in transitioning so quickly and trying to make something work for students who were paying a fairly high tuition to get their degrees here. A second thing that I really learned from what was happening during that transition period was just not just the different kinds of labor, but then the additional emotional labor of pastoral care. There's a lot of pastoral care that I found myself doing, and this research has shown that female faculty of color often have to take on these roles. Students often come to us with various personal and professional concerns or learning challenges or problems in their other courses. And this suddenly fell on a few of us. So we were doing a lot more of these online meetings with students. So one of the strategies I tried to undertake was make this known to the university, make this known to other faculty, complain about it. And Sarah Ahmed, a really well-known feminist scholar, talks about complaint as feminist method or feminist pedagogy or feminist strategy. And if we do not let it be known, it remains invisibilized. So this is what happened in that first week or two. A second point that I want to talk about is my ongoing concerns with online teaching, because we just finished our semester. We have a 16-week semester, so the disruption happened halfway through it. Is obviously what was already mentioned earlier by Derek and Holly in terms of and Amber in terms of the digital divide, connectivity issues, infrastructural disparities, which affect student learning. And it showed these colonial patterns of access to technology and infrastructure and safe spaces of learning, not only among students who were forced to leave the US or forced to leave campus, but also regionally and within rural urban divides within the US. Students in Native American or indigenous communities do not have high connectivity, and those kind of patterns of privilege and disprivilege became very evident. So one of the first things I did was try to figure out what is the best way to use the technology that the institution mandated and still make it possible. So I quickly went into asynchronous teaching to reduce busy work, and reduce workloads, increase extensions, reduce expectations, which I think all of us have done, and get rid of some assignments. So as Derek was mentioning, just kind of not fully suspension, because that would probably not go down very well at this end, but maintaining some semblance of what the course was like initially, but then having worked with students and configuring what is better. And at the same time, but also working with students that if they didn't want to have their video on, that was fine, because not everybody has their own safe space or a bedroom or a quiet space from which they can learn. But as a result, what I learned also was that this encouraged a lot of students to just switch off. And that kind of disengagement is a challenge when you're trying to foster critical learning and analytical thinking, because you can't really read student body languages and how material is being received or being able to respond in real time. So there was that kind of disengagement from students who were kind of checking into class, but then video and audio were off. So these are kind of the things that I noticed, and I haven't quite figured out how to work with better. But one thing in becoming asynchronous was trying to find documentaries and other ways of assessing learning through journaling, but then also through these open dialogues that we were having. One thing that really did show up is that institutionally across the US, and having talked to other faculty elsewhere, is that representational issues were not really addressed, in representation among students who were present and able to learn, but then also amongst faculty in terms of who were able to work with what they were, the kinds of material they were teaching and the pedagogies they were deploying. And of course, you know, many of us face issues of structural racism, global heteropatriarchy, misogyny, ableism, and all of that. And those really started to become more apparent as we kind of quickly went online. And this leads to what, you know, we call the depoliticization of education into this kind of technocratic, technology-driven imperative of this unidirectional education, which is not always collaborative or critically engaged. Another issue that comes up repeatedly is Zoom bombing or racism, you know, in the classroom when people infiltrate, and these are obviously new challenges of racist incidences and traumas in classroom teaching, whereas in person you can control who comes into your classroom space. Digitally, you can't always. So one way to do that was obviously through controlling external access, entry to online classrooms, but we still need to configure how we talk about these issues, because that kind of trauma is not just for the faculty, but for the students in the classroom. And then, you know, drawing on, you know, the work of, you know, scholars like Paulo Freire or Bell Hooks in terms of kind of how do we think about critical and non-critical pedagogies, and this banking model of learning that's being reinforced through these digital methods, again, is something that we need to constantly complain about and talk about with other faculty and administrators. So that's something I've been doing, and I think I've become quite of a nag globally about this, but that's okay, because somebody needs to be heard. You know, some people do not have the voice, and some people just need to make a lot of noise. The third thing that I kind of want to touch upon is that, you know, after having done, you know, having talked about what I faced and then what I'm continuing to learn, is that what are the challenges and opportunities and ongoing kind of our approach to decolonizing pedagogy and maintaining anti-racist, anti-imperial classrooms should this pandemic continue, which it is likely to do, and how are we then going to deal with, you know, what comes up. And if we're going to follow these kinds of, you know, learning that we aspire to or have had experience in doing in in-person classrooms through active debate, collaboration between students on projects, discussion among student and faculty, and the kind of interactive based learning instead of the banking model of learning, we need to figure out how to have more inclusive classrooms that are oriented towards equity and justice, rather than this kind of banking model or this, you know, this learning that is just assessed through certain kinds of mechanisms. And what we're seeing now is that there's a huge co-optation of decolonial and diversity languages that are being increasingly institutionalized in this kind of neoliberal capture of higher education, while simultaneously there's this kind of capitalist restructuring of higher education that's already ongoing. I mean, Goldman Sachs came out with a report in March about how universities will become irrelevant and will just all go into online education. That is a complete and utter discounting of the different ways students learn and what needs to happen. And I agree with what Derek was saying, that we absolutely have to fight to defend this, because there's already this kind of Frankenstein model that is being cobbled together from the old world that we knew into this new world that's being birthed, and that is not necessarily going to be just or equitable unless we make it. But at the same time, what I've learned through this process is that this moment has offered increased opportunities to have these conversations about global inequities, about ongoing colonialities, about racism and capitalism and heteropatriarchy and all of this, and ableism, which may not have happened if we weren't being, you know, confronted with these challenges. But what we need as a result, and I think that we're not seeing enough of, is like greater reflexivity of what is possible, about people checking in their various privileges and working more collaboratively and being greater allies. So we need to have these discussions with our students and our colleagues and with university administrators. And we have to continually challenge these trends that are happening both within higher education, but also through forces without, from outside of higher education. Because otherwise what we're going to see is this pandemic being used as an excuse to, you know, make more these kinds of online teaching which is not critical, which doesn't address concerns about, anti-racist, anti-imperial, or decolonial pedagogies, but relies on this unidirectional banking model of learning, which is not very helpful. So irrespective of what we teach in terms of topic, our ontologies or epistemologies, we need to be very mindful of what is happening institutionally, but then also extra institutionally through global forces that are really showing what the ruptures and the fissures are, and where all of these kinds of problems that are often papered over, but we cannot allow them to be papered over because that does a horrible disservice to everyone globally. So I think I'll end a little bit early so we can have more time for discussion, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful reflections, and to continue with it, actually in a way with what Farhana, concluded with. What I'm going to speak about is I'm going to focus on the issue of digital divide in Bhutan that we encounter here, and how as an individual I'm trying to cope up with it. Obviously, I'm not going to use the word solution. Obviously what I'm going to talk about or what I'm going to reflect upon is not an exact solution, but in a way I'm trying to, as we're all grappling with this problem, in a way I'm trying to, cope up with this issue. And obviously we know this issue of digital divide is a, colonial/capitalist problem. And irrespective of a country, whether it has been physically colonized or not physically colonized, this issue is prevailing everywhere. Now so I will be dividing my reflection widely into two parts. So first, I'm going to briefly give an image about how the problem of digital divide exists in Bhutan. So if I focus on the perspective of this rural-urban divide, there are various dimensions of digital divide. So I'm just specifically focusing on one particular perspective, that is the rural-urban divide. And we see that one interesting thing, that obviously Bhutan as a country is connected through the internet services all over. So whether you are in a so-called urban area, whether you are in a so-called rural area, you have internet connectivity. But the problem arises about the quality of connectivity. So when we look into the quality of connectivity, what we usually see is the areas like the capital city, the cities which are existing nearby the border areas of India and several other parts of other countries with which it shares the borders. Usually we see that those areas are always heavily burdened with tourists and various kind of commercial activities. So in those kind of areas, usually we see that the internet connectivity is quite better as compared to the various other areas, the so-called the remote areas. Now, when I use the term remote, I am talking about geographical and topographical remoteness. So if we look into those remote areas, we see that they have internet connectivity, but it is always low. Apart from that, they face various other forms of technical and connection issues, for which the students who are mostly my students. When I'm talking about the students, I'm talking about the students in my college who are mostly based in those so-called remote areas. They face a massive challenge while attending the classes on a regular basis. Now, coming to this element of, what Farhana pointed out, that it was a sudden transition. It was the same case for our college as well, because we have hardly any experience of conducting online courses. Most of the colleges in Bhutan, they actually have this culture of face-to-face teaching. So we don't have this element of online teaching. So it was a very fast and sudden transition for all of us. But how as an individual I am trying to cope up with these challenges. So prior to talking about the different initiatives that I am experimenting with, like other faculties along with me are also experimenting with in the process, I would like to give a brief background of the students, because it is important for us to know like what accessibility they have, and based on those accessibilities, what kind of initiatives we are taking. So talking about the accessibility, just to let you know, we have the 30 students. We teach a group of 30 master's students in English, and those students they all have access to smartphones. They all have access to laptops. And but out of the 30 students, apart from 2 or 3, the most of the students are located in the remote areas. So for sure, they on a habitual basis, they encounter this problem of network connectivity. So initially, when we started with the classes, what happened is it was seen that out of the 30 students, initially all the 30 will join, but like in the halfway of the class, they will lose internet connectivity. They won't be able to come back again. So maybe a 30 student class will end up with a 20 student class because the 10 students have lost the connectivity and they're unable to join. So as an alternative, the first thing we did is, whenever we used to have lectures through Zoom, or we usually have lectures through Zoom, we make sure that we are recording the lecture. And then these lectures are being put up in the Google Drive, so that later on, if they are getting some kind of internet connectivity, it gives them some space to download those lectures and listen to them, not getting completely disconnected with what kind of discussions are taking place in the class. The second thing that we do is, which is not very effective, but as we say, something is better than nothing, that is WhatsApp and Telegram. So we use applications like WhatsApp and Telegram, which actually usually consumes low internet and also even in low internet bandwidth. Just putting the video part off, it can be used, maybe not for long hours of classes, but for short durations, for dissemination of certain ideas on a quick basis. These things act. Now, if this doesn't work, the third thing that we have is, we often use the element of Google Doc and CryptPad. Like, we use these applications where students who are unable to, due to their internet connectivity, they are unable to put questions, they are unable to participate in class discussions, but they are not left out completely. They have a space where they can put up their questions, reflections, agreements and disagreements, and those are just put up on this CryptPad platform or in the Google Doc platform, and where those are kept as records, interactions on a daily basis. Communications also take place there. So we all keep sharing. And also, it's a kind of decentralized way of sharing our perspectives, because we are, like, as a teacher, I'm not standing in the center of the class and I'm not disseminating something. They are just putting up their ideas. I'm just pitching in with some thoughts. They are continuing with it. So it is also, in a way, interestingly, this thing also works to a certain extent. And the last one, we have this platform, which is called the VLE. The full form of VLE is a virtual learning environment. So this VLE application, what we have is, it functions where we can put up questions, folders, notes, audios, videos, all kinds of things, URL links, which can be put up there. So if anything is missed up, so we have an archive. So we are not losing the continuity, we are not losing the connection. We have an archive to put up there. So if somebody is missing all the 3 things at one go, so we have one place where we preserve all the things, and the students, whenever they have a suitable internet connection, they can go back, they can reflect in all those, they can go back to those documents like lectures or URLs or any kind of notes that have been put down, and they can continue and join back into the discursive process. Obviously, these are some of the things that we are doing here, but nonetheless, as we are all pointing out, we are facing massive challenges with assignments. And as many of you have said that you are reducing the assignments, some of the assignments like class presentations or debates are impossible to do online. So it is mostly on the written part that we are dealing. But yes, I mean, these challenges are there, and we need to collectively brainstorm to really understand, to figure out what could be some other possible solutions. But for the time being, this is how we are dealing, or to be very specific, I am engaging with my students here. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, just a bit of confusion there. Thank you so much for sharing all of your ideas, and thank you for welcoming me onto this platform. Today, I just wanted to share my thoughts through the panel using, I'll turn my timer on. My thoughts in the panel kind of in consideration of my positionality. So as a PhD student, as a curriculum tutor, and then thinking about what's going on in schools or why that concerned me. So as a PhD student, I found the move towards online learning a simple one, because of course we weren't going to have any lectures online. However, as was already mentioned, in terms of the emotional and kind of pastoral support, it has been offered quite both centrally and also from our individual supervisors. But I think the kind of the key contention was in relation to how it affects our projects and how it causes us to kind of make changes in terms of what we will end up doing online, in terms of interviewing our participants and whether we should be suspending. And I think the reason why I raised this point, because I know that a lot of people be thinking about teachers, but the reason why I thought to think about this was about the fact that the implications, the financial implications it would have on students that may have to suspend at this time, and kind of really thinking about those elements, which then brought me on to the PGCE, which, yes, I am offering the pastoral care, and other members of staff are doing the same. We actually have a timetable to do that, which is talking to our students every 2 weeks for up to 15 to 20 minutes about how they're feeling, how they're getting on. They still have their assignments to submit. But of course, with the PGCE course, it's a little bit different, because the students were supposed to spend time in their schools, which they cannot do because a lot of the schools have been closed due to what's going on right now. In terms of pastoral care, of course, different people need different amounts of support, but just being able to offer that, I guess, has been really beneficial for them. Prior to this point, a lot of the work was done online anyway, in terms of them sending out emails to ask questions and so forth. So I don't really see much of a difference there. I think the kind of stark difference is in terms of how the lectures are run. So just to give you an idea, because they were supposed to be going into school, we had to create a new timetable for them, just so that they could get a little bit more information and a little bit more kind of theoretical as well as practical tips for their teaching moving forward. And we used a platform called Microsoft Teams, which is a central platform that is used in the university. I think one of the first kind of challenges was the quality of connectivity that the students had. And as a result of that, the way that we decided to handle that was by turning the cameras off and turning the microphones off, and using a hands-up system on the chat column. And I just wanted to kind of focus on that a little bit in terms of how we are teaching our young people, young people and our interns, in the sense of giving them the freedom and the agency to respond to each other, answer each other's questions and so forth. And of course, that's taken away or delayed using the online platform. So that was something I definitely wanted to think about as well, in terms of who gets to speak and who feels confident enough to say hand up there, and whether, because it's so new and it's happened so suddenly, whether I should be employing the same methods in terms of asking particular students to give a response, which of course is actually predicated on being able to see their expression and see whether they do have something to share in the first place. So I guess that was a big challenge, that has been a big challenge, but has also led me to ask the students following the lesson whether there was anything that could be improved and so forth. So actually that student voice and student evaluation has been helpful, but of course that is contested by the fact that it's not anonymous. So yeah, there's also the platform for them to use Teams within Microsoft Teams, which is basically creating groups, which is set up by the curriculum leader. And there was a question about whether, as kind of individual curriculum tutors, whether we have the freedom to change those teams or not, or whether they are set. And then we just pop in or pop out to hear the discussions that they are having. And I found that to be a really beneficial aspect of the online learning transition. But again, the question of whether the content that they are being taught, the lesson that I had with them was on A-level, so I wasn't too concerned about that. It was about A-level teaching, and it was more in relation to the practical elements they could do. But of course, following that lesson, I really began to think about what's going on in schools and what's going on in our teacher training colleges in terms of the content that we are moving on onto our online platforms. And the reason why I wanted to bring in the point about schools as well was because some schools have decided to respond to the online kind of inequalities by not offering any online services, any online teaching at all, either live or recorded. And the question about whether that is kind of supporting the equality issue or hindering it further is one that I wanted to kind of bring to the table and see what our thoughts were about that. The last thing I would say in terms of PGCE is that the lectures are all live and are not recorded. And so how useful those resources are, I'm not sure. For the moment, yes, but in terms of the students being able to go back and engage with the ideas that are shared, I'm not sure. I think just so that it's not all negative and morbid, I guess the kind of gift of online teaching for me at the moment is the blurred boundaries that it offers. So being able to have these open discussions and ask these critical questions, students to staff and so forth, but also having discussions between departments, because I found Teams to be a much more helpful platform to have discussions with people from different departments than email, for example. And I just wanted to kind of close by saying that the student and staff opportunities and the blurred boundaries there are evident through one teacher that I've spoken to in the past related to this issue. She shared that a student had emailed to ask why the content that they had been given to study in preparation for returning back to school was all Eurocentric, and what the school was planning to do to make sure that there was a much more diverse anti-racist curriculum being offered in schools when they return back. So I think that the confidence to do that stemmed from this time and this freedom that they've had to really think about what they're learning, but also what's going on in society right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for really excellent and insightful reflections on where you find yourself teaching in this moment. I am going to collate the questions from the audience members. So if you would still like to have a question answered, could you please submit that now and just use either the chat box or the Q&A box. And as I'm doing that, I am going to turn over to my colleague who is also at the School of Geography and the Environment, Sneha, who is going to kind of see how we can pull some strands from these various perspectives together and see kind of what we're taking away and what we're learning from this discussion.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you to all of the panelists for an extremely interesting set of talks that made me think of a lot of things that you know, I've been obviously pondering as I've moved to online teaching in the last month or so as well. I think I want to pick up on one key theme that seemed to come up through all of the discussions, which had to do with the danger of the pandemic being used to usher in what Farhana Sultana, called a Frankenstein model, which I found, extremely useful to think about what's kind of happening. Many universities in the UK are, telling us that they're going to make some things permanently online, but we don't know how that will be. And of course, me being cynical in the extreme, I'm really concerned that this is going to be an excuse to charge exorbitant fees from international students from the former colonies and not give them visas to come to the UK. So among that, there are numerous other concerns about this potential Frankenstein model. And I'm particularly intrigued that we're having this discussion in this moment because I think in the months leading up to this pandemic, actually the world was in a state of political ferment to do with a lot of these questions, in fact, about the commodification of higher education, as well as about our political cultures and the place of universities at the heart of those political cultures. And I think, in fact, it seemed that among progressive communities, there was consensus that the physical space of the university had great value, actually, as a place of potential political revolution of some sort. I come from India and I work in the UK, and in both of those places, it seemed as if this was being heavily echoed. So I think I'm going to ask if our panelists could potentially reflect on how they see that political moment, which seemed to be emerging and which hadn't fully played itself out, being drawn out in the aftermath of this pandemic, when it seems as if there's a lot that's shifting, and we're having big discussions about learning and teaching, and simultaneously, there is the threat that our institutions will be, drastically and rapidly and undemocratically transformed using the excuse of the pandemic itself. And I think simultaneously, I'm curious what the potentials of this digital moment could possibly be as well. For one, I haven't seen the use of quite so many digital platforms for connectivity in so long. I feel like we would not have been able to have this discussion with people on so many different continents at Oxford if this had gone on as a physical event. So in some sense, I'm also curious for us to think about what the progressive potentials, I guess, of this digital moment are. And there have been some great reflections on that. And I think, Lesley's final comment on the questioning of Eurocentrism in this moment that has allowed people the time to ponder exactly what's happening is useful. But I'd love to also know a little more on that. Thank you very much.